We are going to learn about tessellations in art class today. A tessellation is a shape that creates a repeating pattern where there are no gaps and no overlaps between the shapes. These triangles create a tessellating pattern because the triangles repeat, the same shape repeats, and there are no gaps in between the triangles and there is no overlap of the triangles. These circles here, while they're pretty nicely aligned, do have gaps in between them, which means they are not a tessellation. And if there were any overlap, they would also not be a tessellation. An example of a tessellation you might see every day is a tiled floor, either squares, rectangles, any shape where there is no gap and no overlap in the tile. We're going to create our tessellations out of squares. You can tessellate with any shape whose corners have a degree that is a factor of 360. We know a square has 90-degree corners. 90 degrees is a factor of 360, so it will tessellate. It will create that repeating pattern. The way we're going to do this is everyone is going to get a 3-inch by 3-inch square and some masking tape and a pencil and some scissors. You're going to take your shape and make one of two types of tessellation. The first is a sliding tessellation, and this is the simplest type of tessellation. It looks pretty impressive when it's done. It ends up looking like this. A shape is cut out and slid to the other side to create your pattern. The way we do that is we are going to draw a shape out of one side of our square that starts and ends on one side of our square. It can be as simple or as complicated as we like. We then cut out that shape and slide it to the opposite side of the square and tape it on. Here's an example of one I've already done. I cut out this palm tree and I took it and slid it over to the opposite side of my square. I then take a bit of masking tape, line it up as best as I can, and tape it together. Now, this palm tree that used to be a square will still fit inside itself in a tiled pattern. I also cut out some waves on the other side. I only cut something out of two different sides, and then I'm going to slide them to the opposite side. So I cut out my little waves, I drew it, I cut it out, and I just slide it over, line it up with the other side. I'm going to carefully tape it down in place, and I want to make sure my tape doesn't get in the way of my stencil. This is now going to be my stencil. My beautiful palm tree wavy stencil. Once I have this taped together, I can create my tessellating pattern. I have a little bit of tape here. If that happens to you, then you're just going to take your scissors and snip off that little bit, or you can just press it down and fold it under so that it does not get in the way of your stencil. You're going to take your new shape that you made out of your square using that slide, and you're going to put it in the middle of your piece of paper and trace around that entire shape. You can then move the shape so that it fits inside what you just traced and trace it again. Here is an example of doing that with my palm tree. I laid down my palm tree stencil and I traced it all the way around. Careful not to wiggle it around. And then I slid it over so that it lined up with the first shape I had traced. And I traced it again. I went back to my first one, I slid it down so that it lined up, and I traced it. I slid it up so that it lined up, and I traced it. What I was left with is this very interesting looking pattern where my first shape just repeats inside itself again and again. You fill the whole page with your repeating pattern. I'm going to show you the other simple type of tessellation that you can do. This again was a sliding tessellation. All I did was slide. You can do a slide and rotate. If I take my square, I cut out my shape and I slide it across, but then flip it the other direction. A slide and flip is what I'll call this. Slide and flip. So again, I took my shape, cut it out the normal way, slid it over, but then just did 180-degree flip right there, or a reflection right there, and tape it in place. I then am going to take my next piece. Now I cheated a little here, so I'm going to have to cut this whole piece off of my wave right there. So now this little wavy shape, it's like a little wave, a small wave here, is going to also slide across, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to flip it, and I'm going to line it up with the edge over here. Or I can line it up exactly where I had it right here. If it started here, well, I can slide it over and line it up there, or right here. It will fit now. I'm going to put it in the first position I said. And my pattern should fit. Now here, if we end up making one that doesn't quite fit exactly, you might have to play with it a little to figure out, well, what went wrong and where can I fix my pattern so that it does tessellate. But when you take that, you can put it on your piece of paper. This is your new stencil, and you're going to trace around it, just like I did with the last one. Trace as carefully as you can. You don't want any huge mistakes or it's not going to fit when you lift it and trace your next one. So you trace carefully, no wiggling. And now, when I slide it, I'm also going to have to flip my stencil the opposite direction. I fit it together, just like before, and I trace. Trace around your whole shape. Holding, moving your fingers as you go so that you don't wiggle. And here's the test to see, did it actually work? Well, my first one was here, so I can slide this direction, and I'm going to have to flip it. And I can see that, yes, it does fit perfectly, mostly perfectly, nothing's perfect, right in there. So I'm going to trace it again, all the way around. And then, yep, that looks pretty good. I can slide it down this way and flip and see that, yes, it still does fit. That is good. That means I didn't make a mistake in my slide and rotate. It's not a perfect fit, but that could be because I either didn't tape very precisely, or I didn't cut very precisely, or I didn't trace very precisely. Any of those could cause it to not fit perfectly. And that's okay. We want it to fit very, very well, but perfection is unattainable. If I had it here and I slid and I flipped, I can see that that does fit that empty space right there. And I would continue. I would slide it over and flip it and trace. For this one, I would slide it and flip and trace. And you fill your whole page. After you're done filling your whole page with your tessellating pattern, you're going to then color your piece. And you're going to choose to color it either realistically or abstractly. Realistically meaning my palm trees, maybe I will make them look exactly like palm trees, or as close as I can. Maybe I will make my waves look like waves. Abstractly could be just choosing a pattern. Here I've got a rainbow, almost ombre in my flamey things. I also have ones where we broke it up into different shapes, and we did a brown stripy pattern in one, and then some nice different blue values through the rest. So those are some different options in coloring, and you'll do that in the next 2 weeks after you have traced your tessellation. So have fun, come up with an interesting shape to tessellate. You can use mine as inspiration or come up with your own. It can be something realistic like palm trees and waves, or it could be just a shape that you play with, you go with, and you come up with something interesting that is visually appealing. Put some thought into how you color it, and I'm sure all of your pieces are going to be gorgeous. Have fun!